Welcome to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carrol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. We are here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York.
This week, Carlos Ghosn's daring escape from Tokyo to Beirut. The CEO turned fugitive comes out swinging against Japan and Nissan.
Plus, Australia in flames and how the country's plight has put a global focus on climate change.
And then the U.S. Catholic Church's strategy to limit payouts to abuse victims, shielding $2 billion by declaring bankruptcy.
All of that still to come. But first up, our top story this week, Iran. President Trump says the drone killing on January 3rd of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was to prevent a war. He may get one anyway.
Let's bring in economics editor Peter Coy with his story in this week's politics section. And Peter, you really take a look at escalation, right? And this is a strategy that President Trump is playing out with Iran. It's a risky one.
It's a strategy he's used all his life. Trump is famous for saying, if somebody hits you, hit him back 10 times as hard. And it's worked pretty well for him in the world of business and politics. The question is now, will it work as well in the world of geopolitics? And, you know, so far, you could argue so good.
Right.
Knocked off one of America's top enemies with relatively small repercussions.
So far.
Exactly, so far. And the question is what happens next? Because Iran certainly has other ways it can get back at the United States, cyber war, terrorism, and so on, as well as just more attacks in Iraq. But then there's also the downside for the U.S. of the fact that Iran is pulling out of its commitments under the nuclear deal. It's going back to enriching uranium. The turn of public opinion in Iraq, until very recently, the Iraqis were turning quite negative towards Iran, and now they're pivoting towards being wanting the U.S. to get out. The Iraqi parliament had a symbolic vote to tell the United States to go home. So, you know, it's definitely a mixed bag whether this kind of strategy works.
Right. Well, and it's a geopolitical story. It's also a geoeconomic story in many ways. This complicates so many things when we think about trade, when we think about just the relationships between all these countries. This is a crucial economic part of the world.
Well, for sure. Now, Trump would argue, and he did argue in his address to the nation, that the U.S. is self-sufficient in oil now, close to it. We still have some imports of oil. But that does not mean that the oil market does not matter. It matters for all the other countries that are buying oil. And the United States remains sort of the world's policeman to some degree. And so it's a bad thing if suddenly the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, for example, by Iran and oil can't get out.
What I think is interesting, and you really do look into this whole idea of the escalation strategy. You know, you write in this story that President Trump is running into a dilemma that we've seen other U.S. presidents face, how to fight a foe who pokes and prods using asymmetric warfare.
Right.
This isn't your typical foe.
That is fascinating. And you go back to Richard Nixon in the Vietnam War, 1970. That was when the U.S. was trying to decide what to do, whether they should go after the Viet Cong bases in Cambodia, which it did, expanding the war, enraging U.S. peace activists. And what Nixon said at the time was he didn't want the U.S. to become a pitiful, helpless giant. That expression has gained currency, which still gets used today. Trump identically does not want the U.S. to be a pitiful, helpless giant.
Right. It's also interesting, too, and Peter, you've written about this before and you write about it again, that this is the United States in a different position in a very different world, and that also contributes to this asymmetry that we're seeing. There's not a lot of precedent for the U.S. acting in this way in a world that is like this.
Well, Trump is not your typical president, for better or worse. There are people who love this kind of strategy. They say, it's about time the United States stopped treating other countries with kid gloves and hit hard. And I talk to people who think that this could work. It could have a deterrent effect on further Iranian aggression. So the jury's out on this, for sure.
Well, I've got to say, I've had so many discussions with individuals about this whole idea of proportional responses, right? And this seems to be how we all work with one another when there's conflict, and yet it doesn't necessarily move things along. And you do wonder when you do something that's above and beyond whether or not it has a more significant impact. So far, it feels like we have had that with Iran, but again, it's early.
Well, what happened is that you could argue that we were getting into an escalation phase. But we seem to be in a de-escalation phase at the moment. Iran chose not to hit the U.S. hard,
Right.
had mostly symbolic missile attacks that killed or injured no one. And then Trump, having vowed that any attack by Iran would be met with serious offensive by the U.S., didn't do it at all.
Essentially said, we're good.
Yeah, he didn't explicitly say I changed my mind because he doesn't tend to do that.
Right.
But
Right.
the fact is that the tensions have diminished. So let's cross our fingers.
Yeah, we will certainly see, but certainly going to be one of the big stories again of 2020. Peter Coy, economics editor, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
All right, and for more on this week's issue, let's bring in editor Joel Weber. The cover story, I love this
Me
story.
too.
It's about total world domination, but we're not talking about the world of politics. Index funds in your piggy bank, they're great investments, but at what cost? Joel is here with us in New York. I'm obsessed with this story. It's so smart, so nuanced. What was the inspiration?
We all have index funds, basically, in our 401ks or savings plans. It is one of the greatest financial inventions of all time. And yet, as they've basically swallowed the market over the past 10 years, we've just seen a boom in index funds as all the inflows have gone to them. It comes with some costs that haven't actually really been evaluated in a bigger way. And some of the most interesting discussion around this might be what happens on the antitrust front.
Well, and this is what I think is so great, and you guys do it so much. Kudos to you, Joel, and your team, because you go into areas that we haven't really kind of heard in the general press. This idea of common ownership, right? We think index funds, great, they're inexpensive, we're all in, we're tracking the index, it's been good for investors. Common ownership, when you see such a concentrated ownership of individual shares among these big three firms, makes you wonder.
That's right, the big three being BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which are really the dominant forces behind index funds in general. Common ownership basically means once you have this big pool of benign money like that basically sits around holding shares that we all, on behalf of all of us that are index fund investors, what happens is that maybe it takes away the competitive juice that really invigorates capitalism. So that common ownership thing is a thing that's been talked about not only in academic circles, but increasingly, we talk about in Washington, the antitrust scrutiny around big tech. That would be the lens that it would happen on for finance.
And one of the things that the story points out that I found so fascinating was it's an idea of power. It's sort of exerted in terms of doing something, or power exerted by not doing something.
And that's a bit, for the most part, the big three have been a relatively quiet force, which is also some of the criticism of them, because especially on topics such as climate change, there's been very vocal activists saying that the big three aren't doing enough on that front.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting, we got a little bit of a history lesson going back to John D. Rockefeller, right, and thinking of the Standard Oil Trust, right, when there was just too much, again, concentration of power.
That's right, and look, again, huge force for good in general, but it becomes what are the ongoing effects as this force for good only gets larger.
I also think a lot about Larry Fink and his sort of outsized role in all of this, the CEO, founder of BlackRock, and he's been very vocal about what role big shareholders should play. He seems sort of caught in the middle of all this too.
That's right, and I think just in general, Fink being one of the big names here, another big name was Bogle, who invented the whole idea of an index fund.
Right.
And for me, looking at this, it was like index funds, I think, were really the biggest story on the financial world of the last 10 years.
Sure.
And here we are at the beginning of the decade, and we wanted to say, let's mark this moment and talk about what this might mean going forward.
Right, and it's interesting how Jack Bogle, before he passed away, his thinking's now about the index fund industry, which is in the story, and it's really great stuff.
Yep.
Joel, thank you so much. Joel Weber, the editor of the magazine. Coming up, he's the world's best-known fugitive.
Talk about former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn. He's speaking out and striking back.
He is indeed. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carrol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. Join us for Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or at Bloomberg.com.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app. And, of course, you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. Return now to the latest twist in the saga of former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn.
He was arrested in Tokyo back in November 2018 on financial crime allegations. Seems like a long time ago, but this week, After a daring escape to Beirut, it's worthy of a Hollywood spy thriller, Carol. We've talked so much about that. In the newsroom, Carlos Ghosn addressed reporters there in Lebanon.
I'm not here to victimize myself. I'm here to shed light on a system that violates the most basic principles of humanity. I'm here to clear my name and to pronounce clearly and emphatically something that was interpreted as a heresy in the Japanese judicial system. These allegations are untrue, and I should have never been arrested in the first place.
BusinessWeek's Matt Campbell has a story in this week's issue. He actually followed Ghosn to Beirut. He joins us now by phone from that city in Lebanon. So, Matt, we just heard from Carlos Ghosn at that press conference this past week, really looking to reclaim the narrative on this story. Was he successful?
Well, he has certainly put himself out there very effectively. He's dominating the headlines, and with good reason. This is a titan of global business who really was in enforced silence for more than a year. He is now making the case that he was the victim of a coup, of a conspiracy, and certainly being heard. Though whether he's being convincing or not, I think it's still too soon to say.
So, Matt, I got to ask you, you were there on the ground. We got a chance to catch up with you right after this press conference. It felt like you and many others were even a little bit dazed by the whole thing, the length of it and just the circus of it all. Tell us what it was like there.
Well, Jason, I've certainly covered plenty of press events over my time in the business. This was one of the more bizarre that I've ever attended. Ghosn spoke for 2.5 hours. I think I stopped my recorder at 2 hours and 36 minutes. He spoke in 4 languages, which, though I speak 2 of them, I couldn't keep up with the other 2, which certainly was a challenge to the people trying to wrangle him. He was all over the place in terms of the topics he was addressing, kind of diverging from subject to subject in a way that I think if you aren't versed in the latest Ghosniana, as I am, but I think relatively few people are, it would have been very hard to follow all of what he was after. So I'm not sure if it was the most effective format for delivering that message.
You know, what's interesting, too, is he talked a lot about the auto industry, about other, and about the success or struggles that the Nissan-Renault partnership is now seeing. What is happening at the company? What do we know about it?
Well, both these companies, Renault and Nissan, are struggling in different ways. Nissan, in particular, which is really navigating a quite severe crisis. And for Ghosn, it's important to stress that. I mean, he has positioned himself for a long time as, if you like, the indispensable man, the person without whom Nissan, especially, could not possibly succeed. And he seems to be relishing the fact that in his absence, Nissan is really in the tank.
And so, Matt, we did hear subsequently from the Japanese government and from Nissan. What are they saying, and how does it push forward from here?
Well, we have both the Japanese government and Nissan reacting with some anger to Ghosn's statements, to his attempts to condemn their actions and to claim he's the victim of a conspiracy. That's just all words at this point, though it is important to note that Ghosn is now the subject of a so-called red notice, which is a sort of Interpol wanted poster. And what that means is that he effectively can't travel. He is stuck here in Lebanon. I don't think he had any plans to leave anytime soon anyway, but it does go to show that he is a long way from being legally out of the woods. He is a fugitive. He has outstanding criminal charges in, a G7 country. These are not charges in Iran or Afghanistan or Paraguay. These are charges in Japan. And so he's going to be followed by this for a very long time, and he has a huge amount of work to do if he ever wants to restore himself to being a titan of global business as he was.
Right, Matt. Carlos Ghosn, no doubt about it, focused on his legacy when it comes to the auto industry and just the world at large. I have to say, though, more immediately, Jason and I have been following some of the Twitter conversations. Everybody wants to know, how the heck did he get out of Japan?
Well, we do know a fair bit about that now. One of the key figures was a guy named Michael Taylor, a former Green Beret, who set out his stall as a private security contractor. We know that there was a large box involved, and that he was smuggled onto an airplane at Kansai Airport in Osaka. So bit by bit, the details are coming together. We don't know what it cost him, which would be interesting to know, certainly, and we don't quite know how this team was able to so effectively defeat what was supposed to be quite persistent surveillance on Mr. Ghosn. So all of that is going to gradually come out, and I and others are certainly working to accelerate the point at which it comes out.
So Matt, before we let you go, you are there in Beirut post-press conference. What is the public sentiment? Has it shifted? Because he has had, I think it's fair to say, a warm but also complicated relationship with the Lebanese.
Well, as you alluded to, Jason, he is something of a national hero here in Lebanon. He's a very accomplished member of the diaspora. There are a lot of people who are proud of that. That said, this country has changed a lot, certainly in the 40 years he's been away, and even in the last couple of years. Recently, there were very large protests in Beirut against the government, against corruption, the notion of an unaccountable elite, and seeing someone come back fleeing criminal charges, no less, and be, if not exactly welcomed warmly by the government, at least not outwardly, he is certainly under some degree of protection here. So that may trigger some of these resentments afresh. So I think we do have to see how public attitudes to Ghosn hold up as the novelty of him being here wears off a bit.
All right, Matt Campbell, thank you so much in Beirut. And of course, still lots of questions out there, but one thing we know for sure, this is going to be a story that we continue along with Matt in 2020. Well, coming up next, we switch gears. Wildfires devastating Australia.
And also sparking, at the same time, renewed global focus on climate change. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. You can also listen to Bloomberg BusinessWeek on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital, and through the Bloomberg Business app.
And you can watch us daily on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
Well, it's impossible to ignore what's happening in Australia. The bushfires there have burned a combined area, this is incredible, twice the size of Switzerland, and they continue.
It's such a tragic story. Let's get to sustainability editor Eric Roston. He contributed to this week's Remarks, Chronicle of a Fire Foretold.
It's very difficult to dispel what's going on in the ground there and the incredible suffering. There have been 24 deaths, and communities have been uprooted and have uncertain, at least near-term futures. When you take a step back, you see that this is a part of a problem we've been talking about for a very long time, and that's climate change.
And the fires aren't over, right?
The fires of this scale, which basically have never been seen before, will go on for months. They've already been going on for 3 or 4 months, and Australia isn't even in its peak summer season yet. There's not a lot firefighters can do. They can try to contain them, protect people and property, but expect this to be in the news for months.
You know, it's interesting. There's a stat in this story that talks about that the bushfires that have burned a combined area twice the size of Switzerland, and as you mentioned, they're not done yet. So just to get an idea in terms of size and scope, it's staggering.
Not only that, but think about more than a year ago now, the California fires. Right. And those absorbed so many people's attention, caused so much devastation in this country. And also we spoke last year in 2019 about terrible fires in Brazil. The Australian fires are more than twice as much as the California 2018 and the Brazil 2019 fires combined.
And so how does this play into the climate picture? I mean, what are the direct ties or even the indirect ties that we can draw from this devastation?
It's pretty straightforward. The 2019 was the hottest year in Australia on record, which goes back about 140 years globally. It was also the driest year in Australia on record, and those are the two things you need to have a bad fire season. They knew months and months ago that it was going to be a terrible fire season just because of what 2019 was like in Australia, and also what the last 20 to 30 years have been like in Australia, which is, depending on what part of the country we're talking about, a 10 or 15% trend toward drier conditions.
I think most of us, I think it's safe to say, who are, reading about this and folks that are reporting on it are saying it's climate change. And yet, from what I understand within the country, that they're not necessarily saying it's climate change. Is that correct?
The political leadership, the prime minister, has not embraced the vast element of these fires that is climate change. That is a kind of political behavior we've seen in Australia before. We see it in the United States. We see it in other countries. It's not based on factually tenable positions. You cannot say that climate change is not happening and be correct. It is human caused, and it's an increasingly important factor in everyday weather.
It's not like, oh my God, we all woke up and said, look what's happening to our climate. Like, there has been a lot of research and reporting done for decades that this is where we were headed, and here we are today.
I think it's we is a word that I'm serious.
Yeah.
That really deserves some scrutiny here. Like, we as a human community, led by scientists who study what's going on, have known about this for a really long time. We, people who get up and have families and have jobs and are just trying to get through the day, do not know. It's an issue. Climate change, it's an issue.
We turn now to Taiwan, preparing to choose between two visions of its relationship with China.
The presidential election is this Saturday, and the months of anti-government protests in Hong Kong, well, they have become a campaign issue.
The story also by Matt Campbell, the hardest working man in Hollywood, Beirut, Singapore, wherever he happens to be. It's in this issue, and it's this week's Business Week Explainer.
By almost any functional standard, Taiwan is a sovereign country. It has a president, a military, and a central bank. But almost no one who matters in international politics recognizes it. Taiwan's not a member of the United Nations or the IMF. The U.S. is its principal ally, but there's no American embassy on the island. China is impatient because Taiwan refuses to accept Chinese rule. Beijing openly reviles pro-independence President Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai has avoided outright confrontation, but she's made China unhappy by building up the military and trying to diversify Taiwan's economy. Her election opponent is Han Kuo-yu. He's a China-friendly populist with the Kuomintang, which had a monopoly on power in Taiwan until the 90s. Some believed Han was open to Hong Kong's one country, two systems model. That permits limited autonomy under Beijing's control. But the Hong Kong protests led Han to reject that possibility. Still, he says that declaring independence is a red line, one that would lead to military and political consequences.
Still to come, we call them the Big Three. We're talking about BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. They're the most important players in corporate America. What? Yeah, that's true, whether they like it or not.
Plus, the Catholic Church's strategy that's limiting payouts to abuse victims.
It's an important story, a tough one, but one you're going to want to hear. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. Still ahead, U.S. dollars, they are everywhere in Venezuela. And Jason, suddenly, That's a problem.
More dollars. Who thought that would be a big problem?
Right.
But it certainly is. Plus, Saudi Arabia stepping into the ring, why the kingdom is embracing sports.
And check it out, everybody. It's that time of the year. We've got our annual list of where to go in 2020.
Book your trips now. But we begin with this week's cover story, the hidden dangers of the great index fund takeover. You are invested in these funds.
Right. We're talking about BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. They are the most important players in corporate America, whether they like it or not.
Here's reporter Annie Massar on total world domination.
Index funds have just enjoyed explosive growth over the past decade or more, especially in the wake of the financial crisis, when investors have realized, hey, it makes a lot more sense in a lot of cases to just put my money in a passive index product and just track markets that way instead of paying for active management. And over time, you've concentrated a lot of, first of all, assets, and second of all, voting power then through the shares that they own in the big three that you mentioned.
And we want to get into that concentrated power and this kind of common ownership by one entity or just a few entities. But remind us, I mean, when index funds kind of came on the scene, they've been around for a few decades already. We've all thought, what a great thing, right? Lower fees, this is good for investors.
Yes, they are unquestionably a great innovation for investors, and investors who are trying to just make the smart financial decision may well decide it makes a lot more sense to own index funds than pick individual stocks or pay for someone to pick individual stocks for me. And then what happens is the index fund firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have the voting rights for all the companies that are underlying those index products. And as a result, they've amassed a ton of voting power in each of these companies that they own.
Well, and throw out some numbers. I thought this was really striking. Combined, the big three own, about 18% of Apple, 20% of Citigroup, 17% of B of A. I mean, you're talking about, that's a big position.
That's right. So if you put together all of their ownership stakes, on average for S&P 500 companies, the big three own about 22% of those companies.
Amazing.
Now, what they say is that they're never going to vote as a block. They're not coordinating how they vote in matters like, board elections or M&A deals. But it's just a striking kind of consolidation of power in some ways. And I think that what the academics and activists say on this is that you just have to watch that trajectory and monitor how that power is being used.
Well, and let's talk about their power in a different venue or a related venue, which is they're also managing the retirements of a lot of the companies that they ultimately have stakes in, right?
That's one thing that's come up. So you've seen various academics come at this from different angles, and one question is, how are their interests and stewardship initiatives clashing, or do they clash? And that is one thing that's come up in academic papers for sure. What the firms say is that they have these stewardship divisions, which are tasked with going out to individual companies and talking about any kind of issues that might affect their industry.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it, right? So you have these big three, and they're managing their retirement plans, and at the same time, they hold a pretty significant position in those shares. So you do wonder, might they possibly vote on matters that might appease management, right? Because they also they want their retirement business, right? I mean, this is all kind of complicated and kind of interesting relationships.
Yeah, there are some interesting nuances. And one thing that's kind of funny to consider is that academics come at it from two different ways in these two different angles. So there's one camp that says, look at all of this voting power that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have amassed. Does that mean that they could one day sway votes one way or another in a way that's worrisome? Another camp says, look at how big these fund companies are and how many different individual stocks they hold.
Right.
And are they too hands-off?
Right.
And that's what BlackRock's Barbara Novick has called the Goldilocks dilemma. Are they doing too much? Are they doing too little? I think BlackRock would argue they've got it just right. But you've got all kinds of angles.
We turn now to a story by reporter Josh Saul, and fair warning, it is a troubling one.
It's an in-depth look at how, as the pace of sex abuse lawsuits escalate, America's Catholic churches are seemingly and increasingly shifting assets and filing for Chapter 11 to avoid big payouts. Here's editor Dan Ferrara.
The churches, they declare bankruptcy because sex abuse claims are going to overwhelm them, right? And declaring bankruptcy is probably the appropriate thing to do. The way they explain it is like if we declare bankruptcy, it creates an order to the process. Imagine if they didn't do that, and then the first big claim could wipe them out, and no other victims would have access to any money.
Right.
So that makes sense on that level. Like to declare bankruptcy. What the story is also examining, however, is steps that precede the bankruptcy, and that the church says are not about anticipating the bankruptcy, but steps that precede the bankruptcy, which diminish the size of the church's estate. So the bankruptcy will typically there's no hard and fast rule, but if a bankruptcy ends up if sex abuse victims end up splitting half the church's remaining estate, then the church has an interest in minimizing the size of that estate.
Dan, and this is what's interesting, and I think most people listening, I think about, corporate America, right? You know, people file, Chapter 11 so that there is an order to the process, and so that, creditors or as many creditors are given, a bite of the pie that's
right. And these
left
sex
out.
abuse victims, in fact, are creditors. That's
correct.
That's their status, their legal status.
So we understand that, but as this story so well, points out that there's two points to it. And the big thing is these assets that are transferred and reclassified. And you talk about these archdioceses, right, that move these assets to parishes. And so that money is no longer part of that settlement pool.
Right.
It's legal.
Yep.
But tell us a little bit more about that.
It's legal, but it is in fact what is in dispute in bankruptcy proceedings.
Okay.
Like the churches will say that certain assets like funds of money, real estate is the single largest one. Says, well, that doesn't actually belong to the archdiocese. That belongs to the individual parishes, and therefore it's not legitimately part of the estate. Well, in a lot of instances, the money was moved from the archdiocese to the individual parishes in anticipation of preceding the bankruptcy.
Right, and that's the point
So
in
then
terms of the timing.
Right.
It used to be part of the archdiocese, and then it's moved off
So
to
the lawyers
parishes.
are trying to, representing the victims, are trying to drag those same properties back into the archdiocese estate.
Because the lawyers on the other side are essentially arguing that the church did this in anticipation of these very lawsuits and are seeking to minimize the estate.
They're definitely seeking. Yes, that's definitely an argument that they're making. And whether or not they say you did it in anticipation of it, they are saying, like, let's be realistic about who actually controls these things. So they may be in the name of the parish, but if the archdiocese has control, then they say that represents ownership.
I feel like, so many things were going through my head when I was reading the story. I was thinking about, a couple that gets divorced, right? And, one of the partners moves assets before they start to go through divorce proceedings so that that's not considered part of the marital assets. Like, it almost feels like to that extent, that's
an analogy that one of the victims used, right? Because it happened in his own life.
Well, there's one stat in the story, and I think Bloomberg BusinessWeek actually did a review of court filings by lawyers for churches, Catholic churches, and victims over the past 15 years. It shows that the U.S. Catholic Church has shielded more than $2 billion in assets from abuse victims in bankruptcies using these methods. So now lawyers are going after that, or tell us what's happening now?
It happens on a case-by-case basis, an archdiocese by archdiocese basis. Like,
how often is it happening? Is it a lot of archdioceses that are doing this?
Well, I think the story says that I think a half dozen or 7 states had sort of an open window, like there's not a statute of limitations applying to sex clergy abuse cases. More recently, a number of states have removed the statute of limitations, and New York State, for example, did it in last summer. Right. And the churches, a number of churches immediately filed bankruptcy for this is coming. Bankruptcy is the only option at that point. Many of those archdioceses had, prior to that, reclassified and reassigned assets.
So, Dan, I want to talk about a key element of this story, which is a thread that actually pulls through the entire abuse scandal, which is sort of who knew what when in many cases, and who is ultimately implicated in the decision-making. Setting aside the culpability around the actual abuse and the cover-up of abuse, this story documents some very senior church officials all the way up to the Vatican who essentially were involved in making these decisions. That seems like a key part of this piece.
The decisions around bankruptcy and around asset reallocation. There's a dispute. Lawyers for the victims say that the lawyers for the church are saying, we'd like to whatever they're talking about. We'll have to run that past the bishop,
right.
Or we'll have to run that up to the Vatican, and the Vatican is saying this stuff is all done at a local level. It's not us.
Coming up, sweat equity in the desert. Love it. Saudi Arabia turning to racing, boxing, and soccer to boost its profile and maybe soften its image.
I like how you work that in there. Plus, where and when to travel in 2020, the 24 destinations that will be especially hot this year. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. Join Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Bloomberg.com, wherever you find your podcasts.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app. And now you can even watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
Speaking of total world domination.
Totally. Turning now to the economic section, the Saudis, they are embracing sports.
Here's editor of the section, Christina Lindblad, on why they're doing that.
They have a blueprint called Vision 2030 for how to diversify the economy. And part of it is to boost kind of Western style entertainment. So everything from music concerts to sports events. And the sports events is something that they've been leaning very hard on in this last year. And already in the year, we've had a very busy calendar. Well, in December, there was a big boxing match. And then last weekend, it was the beginning of the Dakar Rally, which Saudi Arabia is hosting for the first time. And then there are going to be a series of soccer exhibition matches that they've cut a $130 million deal with Spain's soccer federation for that.
So what?
Well, there's a blueprint for this. I mean, and not far away from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, most notably Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the two biggest Emirates, they have been very successful in drawing a lot of Western money, Western sports, Western superstars there.
That's right.
Doha, Qatar is going to host the World Cup. That's obviously been very much in the news over the past few years. So this works economically and from a business perspective, but as with Saudi Arabia, everything's bigger and more complicated.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you're attracting attention to the country. And then also there's been, human rights groups and critics of the regime have seen these events as an opportunity to press, sponsors and the companies, the sports leagues involved to sort of make declarations about like the human rights record.
Right.
To use them as at the very least, as a platform to comment on, on some not so nice aspects of.
I learned a new term from this story.
Yeah.
Sport washing.
Sport washing. Well, yeah, let's talk about that. We hear about greenwashing when it comes to investing. Talk to us a little bit about sport washing.
Right. So basically this idea of trying to kind of, conceal or put a new image, right, on Saudi Arabia. So people forget about the murder of, Washington columnist Khashoggi and also the war in Yemen, which is now its 5th year or 6th, actually. So, but, like I said, it doesn't necessarily work because if people are saying, oh, well, all these foreign media is going to be now going to Saudi Arabia to focus on the Dakar Rally. What a great opportunity to try to get somebody involved. And the thing about sports is even when leagues, one of the things we learned with China recently and the whole NBA thing is that even when leagues want to be silent and don't want to comment on political events, individual players may actually want to.
Well, that's the risk to all of this, right?
Right.
By opening up the kingdom for, more sports and so on and so forth and sports events, you open yourself up for more scrutiny.
Right.
There's
and in the past it has already happened. Certain, Tiger Woods was supposed to, had been rumored to be, to go and play, in Saudi Arabia, and he said no. And I think David Beckham also, there have been rumors the previous year that he was going to play an exhibition match in Saudi Arabia. Again, it was no.
Right.
Certain figures don't really want to.
Mm-hmm. And yet some people say, yes, Phil Mickelson, noted golfer, he's going to go play. It does remind me a lot, and you mentioned this in the story too, of the big Future of Finance Forum that happens every year in Riyadh. It took a break in 2018 on the heels of the murder of Jamal
Yeah,
Khashoggi,
'cause it came very
which
close.
the Saudi government has now been implicated in. And obviously, U.S. intelligence has said that the Crown Prince himself was involved in making that decision. But after a year off, a lot of Wall Street went right back to the desert because there's money to be made
And
there.
the Aramco IPO, right?
Right.
The Aramco
Big time.
IPO is another good example.
Well, lots of money. I mean, like I said, like the Spain, just those exhibition matches that will take place in January, it's a $130 million deal.
Right.
I mean, Qatar is investing billions, to host a World Cup in 2022. So, yeah, big money involved.
Staying with economics, another story in this section, it's about Venezuela's latest problem of having way too many U.S. dollars.
Here again is Christina Lindblad.
There's some good, things that come from it, which is, I mean, basically people are gravitating to the dollar because, the Bolivar just, keeps like losing its value. It like basically depreciated almost 100% against the dollar last year. So, everyone from like hair cutters to, people selling popsicles, on the street now want to take dollars. The problem is, though, you cannot open dollar accounts in Venezuela. Banks are not allowed to. So there's nowhere to stash your money.
Right.
So we talked to this woman who's in an insurance business who wraps her dollars in a plastic bag and tapes them to the inside of her toilet tank in her office. So there's a big concern that this is going to spark another wave of crime like the one that Venezuela saw at the end of the 1990s, which was pretty severe.
Help me understand something first. Let's talk about the bank situation. So, like, if I go to a bank in the U.S. and I have a foreign currency, can't they change it and deposit it?
Well, nobody wants to change their dollars into bolivars
Because it's worth nothing.
Yeah, because a week later,
right.
So you want to keep your dollars, but in very few countries are banks really like in the business of opening foreign currency accounts.
So people are hiding them truly, like as you said, under their toilet seat or in their mattresses,
Yeah.
and you're talking in some cases thousands of dollars.
Right. I mean, some banks are allowing people to put them in their safety deposit box, but imagine how you'd have to take out many, right? After a while, if you're a business trying to shove dollars into your safety deposit box.
Well, and you have people, trying to get the dollars out of the country even. There are limits on what you can do. So you have an anecdote in the story about someone who sent, I believe, his wife and daughter each with
his wife and mother, so $10,000, right, is the limit
ceiling,
that you can bring into the U.S. without declaring it to customs. So so you went right under. Yeah, he has a bank account in Miami, but he wasn't able to, wire the money in there.
So, Christina, my question is, why doesn't Venezuela just adopt the U.S. dollar, especially since it's been, in some regards, a stabilizing factor for the country, right, as a means of transaction?
It has, but politically, it's a radioactive option. I mean,
other countries have done it, though.
It's true, but I mean, the U.S. has sanctioned Venezuela. I mean, this is basically like the U.S. is kind of, diplomatically at war with this country. So it would be a loss of sovereignty that would be unacceptable to the Maduro regime. At the same time, the government has actually, Maduro has publicly said that, informal dollarization has been good for Venezuela, because it has provided more price stability. It has, there's an incentive now to save and invest that there doesn't exist with the bolívares, right? So it's it will stay in a gray area. A lot of other countries actually tolerate this, there's countries in Africa and other places that haven't formally dollarized, but, tolerate informal dollarization.
Coming up, where to go in 2020.
Pack your bags, everyone. 24 spots that will be particularly enticing this coming year.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carrol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. You can also listen to us on the radio on Sirius XM Channel 119, also AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also check us out on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
This week's Pursuits, it's a travel takeover.
We tapped our network of in-the-know editors and global correspondents to deliver 24 spots that should be on your go-to list this year.
Or your to-go list, as you might say. Here's travel editor Nikki Eckstein.
This is a year-long project. As soon as this one goes to bed, I start on the next year's version. So I'm already working on 2021. This is, all year long. We're trawling for hotel news, culture news, museum openings, exciting different developments that are coming on the horizon. And then we're pairing that with data insights from Google, from our trusted travel experts around the world, to put together an authoritative guide that tells you not only where to go, but when to go and why.
That's what I love about this. But what I also love is that you respect kind of established places that maybe have a new twist on them, but you also embrace the new.
Absolutely. There's nothing to say that we can't go back to Paris every year and love it.
Right. We can go back to Paris every year.
Right.
Totally.
But
let's go now.
For the record, Paris is not on this year's list. It was on last year's list. But a classic that's on this year's list, I would say, is Budapest. And I think most people that think about Budapest think about going on a river cruise. Mm-hmm. And so this year we're saying, don't cruise there. Do a land trip. The hotels that are opening in the city center are really spectacular and pushing Budapest into a new level of luxury. There's one that's called the Matilda Palace being opened by Luxury Collection that is literally the city's answer to Buckingham Palace. So staying in Budapest is suddenly going to become very posh, where before it was a little bit less so.
All right, so let's stay in Europe. You also mentioned Northern Italy. Again, not that off the beaten path, but you have a little bit of a twist here.
Well, sure. I think Italy has been Italy is always trending, let's not lie. But Southern Italy in particular has been very buzzy for the last few years. We're saying go north. We're saying do the Dolomites, the mountains that hug the Austrian border. We're saying do Milan, a city that people go to for work, but never really put it on their bucket list per se. It's becoming a really vibrant city with art and galleries beyond the fashion that you already know and love. We're also saying spend more time on spas, health, wellness, hiking in this northern region, and then eat really well because Chef Massimo Bottura and his wife Lara, who run the #1 restaurant in the world, they have opened a hotel in the countryside outside of Modena, and it is #1 on my bucket.
It sounds
I just saw
magical.
that. It was on 60 Minutes just a couple weeks ago.
Oh,
They had
you're
an
right.
interview with him.
You're right.
It was amazing. It looks
And
incredible.
I
Plus,
know
the
them
Olympics are
personally,
coming.
and they are the most wonderful hosts that you could ever
Really?
imagine. So
All
you
right.
must.
Okay.
It's also
Done.
interesting. I feel like there were some several times James Bond references.
Jamaica,
Yes.
where the new Bond movie is being shot, the one that's coming out in April. This is like a place where a lot of Bond movies in the past have been shot, and again now with the release in April of
No Time to Die.
This is also where Live and Let Die was shot, so there's some interesting connections between those two movies, and some of the hotels are being renovated where the movies were shot in the past, so it's exciting.
Bloomberg BusinessWeek is available on newsstands now.
It's also online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app, your must read.
It's the cover story, no-brainer in some ways.
Great
I've been
story.
talking a ton about it in the newsroom. I got to catch up with Annie Massar offline about it just to understand sort of the reporting behind it. She covers BlackRock and just the extent to which these funds are part of our everyday lives in many ways, our retirements.
Right. Everyone's in an index fund for the most part. You're going to want to check out this story. You're also, we've been checking out this story all week. Carlos Ghosn.
Oh, my goodness.
Matt Campbell getting no sleep this week, but really getting into the press conference. He was in the room there when Carlos spoke for several hours, really getting into kind of the twists and turns of this story, and it ain't over.
Can't wait for the movie. Check out our Daily Business Week podcast. It's available at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Bloomberg.com, wherever you get your podcasts. And we're on YouTube.
Right.
Starting this week, just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
More Bloomberg Television starts now.